It was a chilly Friday afternoon when Jasmine Williams, a successful billionaire entrepreneur in her early 30s, hailed a cab in downtown New York City. The day had been a whirlwind of meetings and calls. She was looking forward to a quiet ride back to her penthouse. She wore a simple black coat, sunglasses, and a soft smile, carrying none of the flashy signs of her wealth. After all, she preferred blending in, not drawing attention to herself. She climbed into the cab and gave the driver her destination. The driver, a middle-aged man with a thick accent, glanced at her through the rearview mirror but said nothing. He pressed the gas pedal, and the cab sped into the traffic of the city. For the first few minutes, there was silence. Then, as they hit a red light, the driver began to mumble under his breath. Jasmine, who was checking her phone, noticed that his words seemed to carry an uncomfortable edge. She looked up, catching his eyes in the mirror. "What's the matter?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. The driver's frown deepened. He was a man who had seen a lot in life, but today, something about this woman, her calm demeanor and her polished, expensive taste that didn't scream wealth, irked him. Maybe it was the way she looked so poised in this city, a city full of fates. "You rich people," he began, his tone more frustrated than polite, "always think you can do whatever you want. But you don't know the real struggle. You don't understand how hard it is for the rest of us." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. She could feel his anger building up. "Excuse me?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "I don't believe I did anything to offend you." "Oh, you don't have to do anything, lady. It's just who you are," he spat out, his irritation evident. "People like you make it harder for people like me to get by. You live your fancy life while the rest of us are stuck driving you around." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. Her grip tightened on her phone, but she maintained her calm composure. This wasn't the first time she had encountered such prejudice, especially as a black woman in a world where many were quick to judge her success. But something inside her snapped. Without saying another word, she opened the door and got out of the cab. The driver looked at her, a smirk playing across his lips. "That's right, walk away," he sneered. "Go back to your fancy mansion. I bet your father owns half of this city." Jasmine stood still for a moment on the sidewalk. Her gaze was unwavering. Then, calmly, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, making a call. "I need you to send a car over to 5th and Broadway. Right now. Thank you." She ended the call and turned back to the cab. She knocked on the window. The driver, now slightly surprised to see her still standing there, rolled down the window. "What do you want, lady?" Jasmine smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think you should know something," she said, her voice low and steady. He leaned in closer, intrigued. "My father owns this entire fleet of cabs," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you're not the first one to treat my family poorly." Her smile faded into a knowing look, a glance that spoke volumes. The driver's face drained of color. His cocky expression faltered as he registered what she said. He stammered for a moment, trying to say something, but words failed him. Jasmine gave him one last, deliberate glance, her eyes meeting his with a touch of pity. "I think you should be careful next time you make assumptions about who's sitting in the backseat. You never know who might be the one owning the car." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away. Just a few minutes later, the car her assistant had sent arrived, and Jasmine slid into the backseat. As the car drove away, she looked out the window at the busy streets of New York City, her mind already on her next big project. She wasn't angry anymore. She had learned long ago that people like that driver were usually more afraid than anything else, afraid of change, afraid of the unknown. And her mere existence was a reminder that change was already here. Back at the cab, the driver sat frozen, staring at the rearview mirror in disbelief. His mind raced, processing the reality that the woman he had kicked out of his cab was not just any rich person, but someone whose father had the power to shape the very world he worked in. The shame of his words washed over him, but it was too late now. In the end, it was not just the lesson that he had to learn, but the realization that one should never underestimate the quiet power someone might carry, especially when they are the ones holding the keys to the future. The next morning, Jasmine's father made a quiet but unmistakable call to the cab company's management. He had never been one for drama, but he believed in teaching lessons in the most effective ways. As for the driver, he would soon learn that some lessons hit hardest when they come from the people you least expect. The next day, the cab company received a call that would change the driver's life. Jasmine's father, known for his calm and calculated nature, had made sure that the message would be delivered with discretion. He had dealt with situations like these before, but this time, it wasn't just about his business. It was about integrity, dignity, and respect, values he held dear and wanted to instill in his employees, whether they drove a cab or managed board meetings. The driver, whose name was Raj, had been working for the company for over a decade. He was a man of routine, a man who had learned to trust his instincts, but his instincts had failed him this time. In his mind, Jasmine had represented everything he resented: the wealth he couldn't access, the ease he couldn't achieve, and the constant reminder of a life that seemed out of reach. But he had been wrong. And now, the weight of that mistake pressed down on him. Raj was summoned to the company's headquarters. The management had already been informed of the situation, and they weren't pleased. They valued their drivers, but they also valued the reputation of the company. When Raj walked into the office, he could feel the eyes of the senior staff on him. They didn't need to say much. His nervousness spoke louder than words. "Raj," the manager began, "you've been with us for a long time. But this behavior, what you did to Ms. Williams, is not something we tolerate. Do you know who she is?" Raj nodded, still feeling embarrassed, but couldn't bring himself to speak. "She is the daughter of one of our most important partners," the manager continued. "Her family owns this entire fleet of cabs. And her father is not someone who takes these kinds of things lightly. We've already discussed this matter with him, and let's just say that he's not pleased. Your actions have consequences." The room was silent as Raj absorbed the weight of his mistake. It wasn't just a reprimand, it was a wake-up call. He had crossed a line, not only professionally but morally. The company might have been understanding, but the lesson he had learned was far deeper than anything he could have anticipated. Meanwhile, Jasmine had moved on from the incident. She was used to dealing with the challenges that came with her success. People often misunderstood her, judging her by her appearance or her family's wealth, thinking they knew her story when they didn't. But in the end, she knew who she was, and the way she handled the situation with the driver was just another example of her philosophy. Never let anyone define your worth, especially those who refuse to see beyond their prejudices. A week later, Jasmine's father called her to check in on the situation. "Everything is taken care of, sweetheart," he said with a tone that was both reassuring and stern. "I made sure he understood the importance of respect. He won't be bothering you again." Jasmine smiled softly. "Thanks, Dad. You know I didn't want any trouble." "I know," he replied. "But sometimes, people need to be reminded that kindness is never a weakness, and you never know who's watching. You're doing great things, and no one should ever try to take that away from you." Jasmine appreciated her father's wisdom. It wasn't the first time he had helped her navigate through life's challenges, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But this incident had taught her something valuable. It was not just about having power, but knowing how to use it in a way that was fair, measured, and grounded in integrity. As for Raj, he learned the lesson the hard way. A few days after the meeting, he found himself back behind the wheel of a cab. But this time, his perspective had shifted. He began to understand that it wasn't the wealth of others that had caused his frustration, but his own insecurities and judgments. He didn't need to make assumptions about people based on appearances or status. After all, everyone had their own story, their own struggles. He was more mindful, more respectful to every passenger who entered his cab, understanding that kindness went a long way. The incident had humbled him, and he knew that his actions had consequences, both for himself and the company he worked for. He vowed to never let prejudice cloud his judgment again. In the end, both Jasmine and Raj went on to lead their lives, each carrying with them the lessons they had learned. Jasmine continued to build her empire, unwavering in the face of prejudice and negativity, while Raj, having realized the error of his ways, became more aware of his words and actions. Sometimes, the greatest lessons come not from what we are taught, but from the experiences that push us to grow. And for both of them, that day in the cab had been just such an experience.